Hello, guys. You're listening to Biometric Authentication News. This is your host, Satish Kari. And today on our show, I have Pradheep Sampath. He is VP of Product at ID.me. And today he's on our show to talk about digital wallets and identity. Pradheep, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, Satish. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And let's get to the questions. I know your ID.me is focused on digital identity. And how is it different from physical identity? Give us a brief overview.
Yeah, sure. Identity in general, the way I like to think about it is it's the trust layer that's foundational to transactions between people and organizations, whether it's the offline world or whether it's the online world. Right, today, governments, they've issued driver's licenses, state IDs, and passports, and these documents help establish legal identity in the physical world. And while they're very helpful in the physical world, by themselves, there's not much you can do with these documents in the online world, right?
Yep.
And what I'm trying to say is that organizations have not yet issued digital IDs that are both portable and secure.
Mm-hmm.
If you take Google and Facebook login, right, they're portable, but they're not very secure.
Yep.
On the other hand, your bank login, Satish, it's secure, but it cannot be used outside of that particular bank for the most part.
Sure.
So in our online ecosystem, most trusted logins are not portable, and most portable logins are not trusted. And the way I've started thinking about it is, from an identity standpoint, the internet today, it's a walled garden with each website creating a login that's pretty much useful on that website.
Mm-hmm.
So what characterizes and defines digital identity is that digital identity needs to prove that a person is who they say they are online. And it also becomes the basis for an individual to be recognized as they go from site to site on the internet. So that's how I think about digital identity and how it's distinct from physical identity.
Okay, makes sense. Very valid points. Okay, so that gets me to the next question. When you are online, how do you prove that you are you? As you just suggested, in a real world, it's pretty relatively well proven formula. But how does that pan out in the online world?
Yeah, in order to prove your identity in the online world, we do need to strike the right balance between access and security to establish this online identity. So creating a digital or an online version of your own legal ID, it requires two things, right? It requires strong identity proofing, and it requires strong multi-factor authentication.
Sure.
And when we say identity proofing, right, it's basically verifying the identity of the user when their online account is opened. And then, with multi-factor authentication, you secure that account right away to prevent account takeovers upon future logins. So let me talk for a second about how identity proofing can be effectively done online. Mm-hmm. The first step would be to verify the user's identity. And like you said a moment ago, you can take your offline artifacts like your driver's license, your passport, and state IDs and use that as a basis. But the one thing that the industry is waking up to lately is that because of all the recent breaches that we've had, we no longer can use knowledge and knowledge-based authenticators and identification as a basis. And neither can we simply just rely on information coming back from credit bureaus exclusively because your information and mine is already out there.
Yeah.
So for online identity proofing, banks and telecom providers, right, mobile network operators, they're taking on an increasingly important role to establish identity because, let's face it, right, they've got a ringside view into the user's journey on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take non-trivial investments on the part of bad actors to spoof this at scale. Mm-hmm. And so regulations like know your customer and anti-money laundering rules, they're all adding rigor to online identity proofing, but making sure that you do it in a frictionless manner and not deal with lost sales. Now, two more points I want to make on this topic is it's not sufficient for us to identify a person using their just core attributes like name and date of birth and social and address. You need an effective way to look at a person and say that, yep, I can prove that they are a student or they're a doctor or they're a patient or they're a lawyer. So we need an effective way of identifying a person online, not just based on the core attributes, but also their extended attributes which make up their identity. And finally, when you secure that identity, you got to look beyond text messages on cell phones because they're now susceptible to man-in-the-middle kind of attacks. Mm-hmm. So from a multi-factor authentication standpoint, got to start looking at biometrics and FIDO, U2F keys, and similar technologies to prove that the identity that was just verified and proved is secure for the long term. So that's how I think we can prove you are who you are when you're online effectively.
Makes sense. And FIDO and U2F do make a huge impact. And very good to hear that FIDO is making news because I've been involved with FIDO a little bit. So very good to hear that.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. So as we move on, how do you prevent large organizations from collecting? Today, every organization individually collects a lot of data around you. And the question of collating that data, personal data, without your consent, and finally it shows up in some form of shape as an action on your end. So how do we prevent the large organizations from collecting or selling such data? Do you see an answer to it, or what's the landscape like?
There's got to be answers to that. And I think that's a great question. And we talked about the trade-offs between access and security online earlier, right? Mm-hmm. There's a third angle to it. And that's the angle you're bringing up, which is users, individuals, being able to control elements of their identity online. And that's very important. Well, large networks, right? Social networks that have huge scale, like Facebook and Google, mm-hmm. by virtue of the fact that they have scale and adoption, they make users make a choice, right? They make customers and individuals choose between the convenience that Facebook and Google offer, which is you can log into a website using a Facebook ID or a Google ID without creating a new account. But on the flip side, you do cede control over how your data is mined and it's used with advertisers. And that's not ideal. There is a better way. The better way is to have neutral digital identity gateways that create secure online legal credentials for individuals. If you have that, individuals, they'll have 100% ownership over all aspects of their identity down to the attribute level. Mm-hmm. And there's also this concept of data minimization, which means that any website out there that's requesting access to an individual's identity, the rules of engagement have to be such that they only ask and receive the bare minimum levels of identity information, the attributes that are necessary and sufficient for that transaction to complete. And finally, right, to get users more control, there's got to be explicit consent at every step that informs individual if their PI, their personally identifiable information, is going to ever be used in the future for targeting and marketing. So if you put all these things together, it becomes a playbook by which individuals will start having more control and not just cede their entire data set for marketing purposes without their consent.
Yep, very true. And it's relatively a huge issue which the industry is tackling today. One thought just ran in my head right now. It's like we have nutrition facts on a label which shows like what percent is going to harm you versus what is not. I wish there was something which was a privacy label which shows like, okay, if I go to this website, this is what I am giving up. I wish there was something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there is a version of that,
Okay.
as users use a platform like IDMe to connect to websites,
Hmm.
there is a very clear and explicit guidance that tells them in going forward, here's the elements of their identity that they are going to pass on to the website. And we can talk about it in a moment.
Yeah, sure. So I understand IDMe has a wallet, and how is it different from the digital wallet and the other wallets like Apple Wallet or Google? I'm sure it's a little bit different. Just wanted to understand what it is. If you could give us an overview, that would be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. So wallets that Apple and Google have, they are primarily from a transaction-centric viewpoint.
Hmm.
The ID digital wallet is very much an identity-first view. So let me elaborate, and it might help for me to kind of explain that ID we're a digital identity network that helps bind someone's legal identity to a shared, secure digital login service. And like I think I've already said, it's our firm belief that an individual owns their identity, right? And so the ID wallet is a digital wallet that really allows individuals to own and manage all aspects of their digital identity, just like the wallet on your person, right? The
Hmm.
physical wallet, the leather wallet,
Hmm.
it might just be a holder of all of your offline credentials for you to use in your offline world,
Hmm.
and you decide what aspect of identity that's sitting in your wallet you're willing to take out and give it to a merchant at any given point in time. Similarly, this ID digital wallet gives an individual the control over exactly what aspects of their identity they want to release to what receiving or relying party at what time. It also offers a lot of benefits to the user. So if an individual is a student, if they're a teacher, if they're active duty in the military, if they're a veteran, if they're a first responder, they can get verified as being part of that group, and that group association can be maintained as an attribute in the wallet, and they can release it to accrue any benefits that they might get by being a member of the military or being a student or by being a teacher. One other thing which is important from an ID wallet standpoint is another guiding principle is never make an individual do something that they've already done. Never make them do it twice. So let's say you've verified your identity and the wallet becomes the keeper, the store of your verified identity. So all you do is release it while providing consent, but never have to go through identity proofing again. So the way I want to kind of summarize the value proposition of the ID wallet is it is what makes an individual's identity portable online. But I should say not just portable, securely portable online.
Sure. Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. And today, right, moving on to the next question, which brings to me to my next question. Today, the identity is owned by businesses and not individuals. And that brings us to sovereign identity. Is that transition happening? Because, sure, ideally, sovereign identity works very well for the individuals, but uh, today we are in a centralized identity owned by the vendors. And how is that changing, landscape changing?
It's changing. It's changing slowly, but we need to all do our part in being part of the identity spheres of influence to hasten this adoption and change. And I think from an origin story standpoint, it all started from our company's view. IDME CEO back in the day, he came to the realization that it's absolutely unconscionable, right, for a veteran to have to disclose their social security number, their date of birth, and show their DD 214 discharge document, all to get a free pastry that a bakery might be offering on Veterans Day, right? So that shows that in that case, the business pretty much started owning their identity. In this case, how do you transfer that power to the individual?
Mhm.
It starts with awareness. And individuals across the world, they need to start becoming aware that they themselves can be the owner of their own identity. Like you said,
Yep.
they need to know that their identity is sovereign. And what I mean by that is nobody else can can read or use or turn off or take away their identity or any aspects of it without their explicit consent as an owner. Now, when that awareness is in place, there also needs to be a platform like the neutral digital identity gateway with wallet capabilities that I was talking about earlier that can help them keep their identity and pass it on with the right checks and balances at every step of the way. Also talk about industry standards, and I think the NIST organization has done a great job in setting forth standards, right? We do have the 863-2, and now we have the -3. These standards are helping establish what the best practices might be for digital identity. And it's working, right? It's working in the sectors that have adopted it. But we as an industry need to kind of take that to the next level and figure out how this adoption can be made faster by making standards like this ubiquitous across industries and across regions, so that what works in the government and healthcare will also work equally well in financial services and retail. And that's when I think the transition from businesses owning the identity to one that's owned by the individual can truly become a reality.
Sure, and you are very right. I think we interviewed Paul Grassi a few months ago on the NIST standards around authentication. We got to talk a little bit in detail about the 862. Yep. So very good to hear that. And the last question for the show: how is IDMe solving the privacy concerns? Because there are solutions in the market today, but addressing privacy is also important. So wanted to check how is IDMe looking at it.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to one point which I was making earlier and kind of build on it. And it all revolves around the concept of data minimization and full disclosure. So at IDMe, we do identity proofing, and we establish both low assurance and high assurance credentials as the circumstance warrants it. So an individual, right, you might go to a particular website which requires, let's say, your name and your date of birth, and they don't require your social security number, so you never asked to provide your social security number. But let's say that you take that same identity and attempt to use it at a website which requires a high assurance credential, in which case that trust will need to be elevated and just get augmented with an additional piece of data. In this case, it might be social security. So I'm coming to the point of full disclosure, where from a privacy standpoint, you as an individual are being told at every step of the journey what elements of data is being collected from you, how it's going to be used, who's going to use it, and what's the ultimate set of attributes of your identity that's going to be shared across the different websites and locations that you encounter. The second aspect of that is granular control over who sees what and when. Just because you as an individual have given your identity to a certain location, to a certain relying party, it doesn't mean that you've done it forever. You have the control, and ideally gives you the control via the wallet to revoke that consent at a moment's notice. And finally, privacy, I think, is underpinned by security. With all the breaches that have happened out there in the industry, I want to say that security of the platform is a core way of making sure that user data remains private. And in order to safeguard user privacy, right, the IDMe gateway solution, identity gateway solution, it's gone through all the requisite rigors. It's FICAM approved, like we talked about earlier. It's aligned with FIDO standards. It's got support for all the industry-leading integration protocols, including the FIPS 140-2. We use encrypted JSON tokens. We can integrate using SAML 2.0, OAuth, OpenID Connect. So the long story short, we're leaving no stone unturned in terms of protecting user privacy, and that's how they can rest assured a neutral identity gateway that IDMe is helping people perform identity proofing, getting credentials, but also do so comforted by the fact that there's privacy and security is being safeguarded.
Wow. So, yeah, that is very informative and very helpful. Thanks a lot for being on the show.
Thank you, Satish. It was a pleasure.